الحمد لله نستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ونشهد أن سيدنا مولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله تعالى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم
So
السلام
this
ورحمة
is
الله وبركاته.
our seminar or webinar on the issue of brain death. So we all understand this concept of brain death. It exists in our lives on the sense from the medical perspective that we hear about it quite a lot. And it relates to a number of very important subject areas that affect us all to some degree, either us, our family members, our relatives, or even our patients at work. So issues related to organ transplantation, for example, when is it possible that we can retrieve organs? Also issues related to withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, all are in essence pending on the issue of what is brain death, and is brain death an acceptable standard that we can use. So inshallah, today we have some very special panelists. Let me begin by first introducing Sheikh Tariq Al-Anqawi, who is somebody who is a professor and lecturer to the assistant professor at the College of Sharia at the Al-Qur'an University and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And Sheikh Tariq Anqawi is somebody I've been communicating now for some time on a number of different issues. He's somebody who's done an extensive amount of research from a number of different perspectives on the issue of end-of-life care, inclusive of the topic of brain death. So it'll be a real pleasure for us all to hear from him and give us some kind of deep insight into some of his understanding related to this topic and some of his research that he's done over a decade, I think. Now, we also have Dr. Abid Hussain. So Dr. Abid Hussain, a friend, and also somebody who is also a consultant anesthetist at the Central Manchester University Hospital, somebody who has had an interest in Islamic medical ethics for a number of years, and he's done some recent articles on brain death, and he's had quite an interest in the subject for some time. Now, so we are supposed to also have Dr. Asim Padella. So many of you are familiar with him. He's a bioethicist or a Muslim or Islamic bioethicist. But we're not sure whether he'll be able to join us today because he's traveling, and I think the issue of reception might be a problem. But he may join us later on, inshallah, in our discussion. Now, let me just set the stage and the platform first. So what are we going to do in the next sort of 1.5 hours? And the answer to that is we're going to explore and discuss the issue of brain death. Now, that's a very loaded term. When you say brain death, it means many, many different things to many different people. So for that reason, it's important that we sort of go into the details of what that actually means. And then I'll also explore the kind of research that's currently out there, not only from the sort of the Western world and the science and kind of research, but also look at it from the perspective of the Sharia, which is what's important for us as Muslims. So we're going to have a kind of a discussion. So let's put it in that particular way. We'll talk around the topic. I suppose our panelists have their own strong opinions related to brain death. So it'd be interesting to hear that, and also to be very open about scrutiny and criticism of various opinions, and how people may have interpreted even elements within the Sharia as well as elements within sort of science research and various other areas. So it's in essence, it's just an open discussion. Now, within this discussion, I'll just emphasize the point that we're not trying to pass a fatwa here. So just in case anybody thinks that that's what we're trying to do, but rather we're just opening up the whole discussion so that more research can be done in this area. Now, having said that, so we will spend approximately 45 minutes discussing, or I will be bringing questions to the panel and also introduce my personal research that I've done. My background is also from the Islamic sort of perspective. I've done quite a lot of work in this area. Also, I'm a medical doctor. So I've looked into this area for now quite some number of years as well. So, and I'll be producing a paper out probably in the very near future, inshallah. But having said that, I will be bringing some interesting points to the discussion and onto the table as well for our panelists and also for my own learning. So let's get into the depth. Before I begin, I think it's also important to recognize the schedule is 45-minute discussion with the panel, and the 45 minutes will be open to yourselves. And if you have any particular questions you'd like to ask, then please feel free to do so. But what I want to just emphasize in this discussion is the discussion around brain death or neurological death is very intense. It's a very in-depth type discussion. So there's a very good chance that we may lose some of you in that discussion. Now, please, if we do, use the chat and put forward any particular terms that you don't understand or any particular idea you don't seem to understand. And inshallah, we'll try to go back to those points and try to open up that discussion again. Now, we could have done this in a very different way, where we could have just had experts and sat around a table and had a nice little discussion about it. Maybe that's something that we can start doing as well. But this is more for general public as well as for our own personal learning, inshallah. So let me begin first. Because Dr. Asim Padella is not here, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably put this question to Dr. Abid Hussain. And that is, in essence, in relation to the idea of brain death. Before I do that, I just want to put forward the idea that there is this concept of neurological death. Now, what does that actually mean? So neurological death or brain death, in essence, means that, and there are different standards that are used all over the world. So I'm not going to go into the level of detail that is already expected of people to know about. And that is that if we have a death, or whatever that means, of so much of the brain or the brain stem, does that equate to what we would consider as death from an Islamic perspective? And if that does equate to something that we would consider as death from an Islamic perspective, then at that stage, are we able to retrieve organs from these individuals? Are we allowed to remove life-sustaining treatment? So let me start with Dr. Abid Hussain. I think we may have lost you on visual for some reason. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay, so as a Muslim anaesthetist, so somebody who clearly has an Islamic ethical overview over the whole thing, what troubles you the most about the neurological criteria for death? I know it's a very broad question, so if you could put it down to maybe 1 or 2 to 3 points in particular that troubles you about this criteria or this standard.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, first of all, inviting me to this webinar so I can share some of my views with the people on the webinar. So my comments that I'm going to make are not necessarily related to the fact that I'm a Muslim, because actual death is the same in every religion, whether you're a Muslim, Christian, Jew, Sikh, Hindu. When you're dead, you're dead. So actual death has no boundaries of religion or jurisdiction. So if you're dead in UK, you're dead in US, you're dead in Saudi Arabia. So some of the things that I find disturbing is that a lot of people who actually support the concept of brain death as death don't actually look into this deeply enough or to take the trouble to find out what brain death actually means. So I'll make a few comments about brain death so we know, things that people may not be aware of. So brain death is a somewhat misleading term, because brain death does not mean death of the brain. Yeah? So it's probably better to call brain death brain failure, similar to what we call heart failure or respiratory failure. Or another way to think of it, brain death is brain arrest, like we have cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest. So this concept of brain death was first proposed in 1968. And it was not proposed as a method, as an improved method or a more advanced method of diagnosing what mankind had understood to be death all along. No, that was not their objective. The Harvard ad hoc committee who proposed this idea of brain death in 1968 proposed it as a new understanding of death. So it's effectively a new entity in which individuals with catastrophic brain injury were considered to be as good as dead, and they were to be labeled as dead and treated as dead. So the concept of brain death was a value-based judgment. It was to fulfill the needs of society to get from point A to point B. So it is effectively a social construct. So the other things I find, I think, disturbing, as you put it. So under the concept of brain death, an individual who is declared dead under this criteria may have none of his organs which are actually dead, but he's considered to be dead as an individual. I mean, that's a paradox. Also, an individual with obvious signs of life, such as a beating heart, blood circulating around the body, chest going up and down, being able to absorb food, digest food, grow normally, fight infections, heal wounds, maintain body temperature, maintain water balance, maintain electrolyte balance, can be declared dead. How is it possible for someone with all these signs, what we consider as life, can be considered to be dead? This is another paradox. And the body of a brain-dead person does not decompose. It can be kept going for years. In one case, over 20 years. That's another paradox. And the only conclusion you can draw from these paradoxes is that brain death is not actual death. So how does this confusion arise? Well, the confusion arises because people conflate status with state. Brain death is a legal status, and I accept that. In many jurisdictions, brain death is legal death. There's no doubt about that. There's no point in debating that. But actual death is a biological state. So a brain dead patient has the legal status of being dead, but he is not actually dead. Let me give you a few analogies to try and explain what I'm trying to say. Remember that no analogy is perfect. So let's start off with the person.
Dr. Abe, we're just conscious of the time, so we need to sort of.
Okay,
So if you get to the
literally 2 minutes. So if I give you an analogy of a person with very poor vision, that person can be registered blind. So under the law of the land, that person is blind. He's not actually blind. And another example I could give you, a person who's born with XY chromosomes, with male genitalia, facial hair, a male voice, if he fulfills certain criteria, he can attain the legal status of a woman. So and he can even change his birth certificate to reflect this newfound legal status, and also be issued with the gender recognition certificate. So the point is, when you say is brain death death, it depends what you mean by death. If you say is brain death legal death, the answer is yes. If you say brain death is actual death, then I would say absolutely not.
Okay, that's a very interesting way of presenting it, and I think it's very valuable that you presented it like that. So what we're doing is we're struggling with the concept of death, or understanding what death actually means. So we've sort of decided that we can call it legal death, and we can call it death proper. So the question arises: what would each one of those two terms suggest and indicate for us? Sheikh 𝐁𝐚𝐥𝐸, from a Sharia perspective, we know that there have been Muslim fiqh councils or Islamic fiqh councils who have discussed this in reasonable amount of detail. And this has been some time ago. So we're looking at 40 years, even 50 years ago, and people still write about this particular subject, but make a lot of reference to them. I know you've done quite a bit of research in this area. Could you just give us a bit of a highlight in terms of your understanding from your research regarding what is understood as brain death or neurological death, and how the Sharia would cast a light on that in terms of, is this an acceptable standard even from the Islamic perspective?
First, thank you for giving the chance. I also extend my thanks to Dr. Abid, because he saved some time explaining many of the good ideas that we can start from. So if we think of brain death, and a simple question should be asked always. One should ask, why is brain death death? Why one would consider a brain dead person a real death or an actual death? Actually, this was not a point of focus in the beginning of the brain death diagnosis, let me say, criterion. As Dr. 𝐅𝐴𝐵𝐷 pointed, 1968, the Harvard Committee, they were not interested to justify why a dead person is a dead person. They just pointed out that it's beneficial for organ donation, and also it could give a room to remove the life-sustaining treatments from patients. And this could be understood if we know that historically, the context at this time, the legal context, it was not allowed to cause death by withdrawing life-sustaining treatments, especially the ventilator. And there were many court arguments and developments in the laws until we had a major shift in the legal consideration for this issue. So yes, in the beginning you see a real gap. Even you know, this guy called Henry Beecher, he's the head of the Harvard Committee. He was quoted in some articles that he said, explaining why they choose this kind of diagnosis to be equal to death. He said we should pick a point where we say the person is dead. So why do we postpone that point until we lose the viability of organs? So it's a pragmatic statement. There is no reason behind it. And he was careless, and I a little bit understand that the pragmatic mentality. He could be an atheist, I'm not sure, but when you look from an Islamic perspective and you think of the meaning of life and death, and the soul department from the body as a essence of the meaning of death, you cannot just neglect the signs of life. Dr. 𝐅𝐴𝐵𝐷 has summarized in a very good way. You cannot just neglect it and consider a person with all these life signs equal to a person who is really dead. After some time, you can notice when you review the research and the writings of medical doctors and medical committees and the legal even writings, ethical writings, you can start to see that in the late 70s, some people started to give a serious trials to provide a judgment, a justification. Some of them were saying that it's the consciousness of the person which is the most important part, and life can be judged as ended when there is no consciousness. But this was neglected, almost neglected later, because of the vegetative state where the patient still have brainstem working to some extent at least, and then he can breathe. And if we say that because his cortex is dead or failed, as Dr. 𝐅𝐴𝐵𝐷 put it, then we will just bury a person who is breathing, and this is absurd. So then some people start saying, you know what, we will give a new justification. Let's say that the body has some functions remaining even when somebody is dead, like the hair is growing. So we cannot just regard any life sign as an indicator that the person is alive. So we should look at something special. And the special thing that almost dominated the academic writings was what's so-called the, I forgot that English terminology, but it means the body is coordinating which is each other. So not every organ is working alone. No, everything is coordinating. Then you have this kind of life that resembles the real life. But actually, this also view had many flaws, and especially when the life-sustaining treatment.
Referring to voluntary control, so having involuntary or voluntary control of the body. Is that what you mean? Yeah. Voluntary control of the body. when
actually,
having involuntary control.
actually, some of the life science, which Dr. Abid said, like when he said that the body fights, the immune system is working, the body is
Yes.
keeping the temperature.
So there
and
are certain
that, yeah,
endocrine type functions that are happening there. Yeah.
these
Okay.
are not just isolated cells hardly working. These are collective working,
Yeah,
integrated
system
working.
in place that's still functioning.
There is a scientist called Alan Shulman. He made many case studies, or you can say a study with collective case studies, and a review study also. And he proved that actually many cases maintain a good somatic health. They live for a long time, and as time runs, when they pass the first few weeks, they can pass the critical stage, and then they will be stable. They will just need a ventilator and some, the feeding, of course, and the hydration. Then in 2008, the debate reached to a very critical point, because the presidential committee, which President Bush has formed, has discussed this very widely, and they involved tens of experts from all fields. And the conclusion was, ironically, they ruled out all philosophical justifications used for justifying regarding the brain dead person as a dead person, and they proposed a new one. So they said Alan Shulman, of course they called them and they discussed with them. They said he was right, and new scientific research show that he actually was right, and we need a new philosophical justification. So to get back to the first point, just allow for 10 seconds. I think one of the major problems, and there are multiple major problems with brain death. One of the major problems, it doesn't really have a justification. And later, maybe you will give me some time to also view the fiqhi justification.
Yes, I think we're going to come to that in quite a bit of detail, inshallah. Okay, so let's get an overall perspective to this. And I think it's important that we think of this in a very systematic way. So the first point is that, I mean, and this is something that I've seen and I've read in even Islamic literature, and that is something about semantics, and that is the use of terms. So when we say death, what does that mean to people? Because when we say that somebody has died, what does that actually mean? And if you sort of look at it from a really sort of stand back at a distance sometimes, I think what we've done is we've medicalized the concept of death. And that can be very problematic for a lot of us, because then what we do is we then start looking at everything from a very physiological perspective when we medicalize everything. But rather what we need to really do is we need to really ask ourselves a very, very important question. And that important question is, what does death mean to me? So if I say that somebody has died, what does that mean? And then relate that to what does it mean in terms of death behaviors? So in other words, when I say that somebody has died, what does that mean to me? That means, in essence, and this is something that everybody would accept. So for Muslims in particular, and that's what we're interested in, most Muslims, in fact, virtually all Muslims would accept the idea that death would be, or death proper, or death as we would see actual death, would be a state where we can now say that this person is ready to be buried. Okay, so that's what death means. Death means that this person is ready to be buried. We're all assured that they have reached a state or a stage, and now we feel comfortable that we can bury this particular individual. So this would be considered as death proper or real death. The question that now, and I'm going to bring this now, I'm going to sort of skip to this particular discussion. And this is important for us because sometimes we get very lost in the discussion of talking about brain death. And we fail to really understand the purpose of why we're discussing this, this whole thing in the first place. And that is mainly in relation to what is it that we can do at different stages through the journey when somebody is alive to somebody who would have reached this stage, which we decided to call death proper. And that is the stage that we can now bury them. And this is where Dr. Abid talked about there's something about legal or moral death, and there's something about death proper. Now, from that particular perspective, and I want to put this to Dr. Abid, somebody who's a practicing anesthetist and somebody who'll come across this quite regularly. And that is, at what stage would you feel comfortable? And this is your own personal perspective to this. It doesn't have to be something that's just generic to what you think everybody else should feel. At what stage would you feel comfortable removing life-sustaining treatment. So that's like a ventilator or even an ECMO, which is something that keeps somebody perfused so that there's blood flowing around their body and also their brain even. At that stage, when would you feel comfortable to actually stop or withhold or withdraw, so I say withdraw life-sustaining treatment? Dr. Abid.
Okay, assalamu alaikum again. Sorry, my video is having a problem.
Yeah,
so
we're
I hope
losing
you can
you
hear
on
me.
the visual side.
Yeah,
Okay.
I've tried a second camera, it's still not working.
Okay.
Anyway, so I think just to mention that when the concept of brain death was introduced in 1968, it was illegal to withdraw any kind of life support from patients, even when there was no hope of recovery. So one of the reasons the concept of brain death was introduced to allow withdrawal of life support, because otherwise the physicians would be charged with murder. And so this ruling was changed in 1975 with the case of Karen Quinlan in the US. And here in the UK, it was the case of Tony Bland in 1989. And he was one of the supporters who suffered.
So we want this to be a more personal, reflective sort of discussion. So let's just skip from.
Okay, so in terms of
let's talk about how you would feel.
So the principle is,
when would you, as a Muslim physician,
so this is,
let's get down to the root, because this is what our audiences are interested in. They're interested in.
So this is based on obviously each individual case. But the general principle is when there is no hope of recovery, no hope, and there's no purpose of carrying on with medical treatment. So that's the general principle. No hope, no purpose. At that point, we would say this. So most of the patients who die on intensive care nowadays are not due to natural causes, but it's where we have tried as much as we can, and we feel there's no point in going on any further. We've done as much as we can from the point of view of medicine. So let's fall back now and let nature take its course.
Okay, so let's say, for example, let's just so that our audience can understand this a bit more clearly. Let's say that you had somebody who now has brainstem death. So let's as a standard, as people recognize the different sort of empirical tests that we do to achieve brainstem death, with also recognizing the level of certainty that we can say that somebody is brainstem death using some of our technology today and our tests that clinical tests that we use today. Would you feel comfortable withdrawing life support on somebody like that?
Yes, I would.
Okay, and you've explained that already, and you mentioned because of the concept of futility. Yeah, that basically that is of no benefit.
So brain death can be think of it as a diagnosis of futility. Okay. Rather than a diagnosis of death.
Right. Okay. So I'm just going to move on to Dr. 𝐁𝐚𝐥𝐬, Sheikh Dr. 𝐁𝐚𝐥𝐬. So from a Sharia perspective, what are the general views regarding this from the Sharia perspective? And then also to give a bit of an insight to your own personal take on this.
The views
from your research.
The views of
about withdrawing life support in somebody who's been diagnosed as brainstem dead.
Well, I think we are moving to a different subject a little bit.
It's a different subject, but I think it relates to the idea of, because I've already explained that we want to move away from this idea of brain death.
Yeah,
brain death is sometimes used as a strong argument. We say, oh no, brain death, we can't accept that, therefore, and we leave it. And what happens with that when we do that is it leaves a lot of Muslim physicians, a lot of families, a lot of Muslim relatives suspended, because we don't know what that means for us practically. So I'm moving away from the discussion of brain death now, deliberately, because as Muslims, we turn to Quran and Sunnah, and that determines for us what we feel comfortable with in enacting certain death behaviors. And the death behavior we're talking about here is removing life-sustaining treatment, like a ventilator, for example. Now, so Dr. Abid Hussain has said that, yes, if there is a stage that we reach where we know that treatment that we're giving this person, also life-sustaining treatment that we're giving this particular individual, we know for sure that there is not going to be any benefit for this particular individual. It's futile exercise, okay? And he feels at that stage that we can now remove the life-sustaining treatment. So I'm just reflecting on that from your perspective, from your understandings of what the fuqaha have mentioned.
Okay.
what is the current understanding related to that, and what is your personal research suggestive of in relation to this topic?
What I reached to is, you can say we have two important factors affecting this matter here. The first factor, you have to decide whether the brain death diagnosed patient is really dead or not. Because if you say he's dead, then for sure you can withdraw the life support because he's simply dead. That's it. What I reached to, and I see Dr. Abid is agreeing, is that he's not dead. We might say he's in a very advanced sickness, hopeless sickness, as he called it, futile maybe, but not death. The other factor that we have to reflect on here is, when do we say that a treatment is not beneficial? When, how do we define futility? And this is a very big discussion, as you maybe remember.
Also in the Western world, it's a huge discussion.
Yeah, as you remember,
how we define futility.
Yes, our last webinar, we discussed this extensively. Actually, my personal view is, I think that saving life is a goal. And as long as you're saving life, it's worth it, and it's a benefit that you should pursue. But on the other hand, also to get myself away from exaggerating, we should also think of mashaqqa, the hardship. What is the effect of the treatment? What is the harms that could happen? And what is the effect of withdrawing or withholding treatment? And to summarize, I'm against withdrawing if it causes death. And in this case, brain death, for sure it will cause death. Okay. But I'm not against withholding some kind of treatments that have not been proven to save life. They are like uncertain trials, also unnecessary diagnostic procedures, which are the most costly, some experts say, in the ICU. We can kind of step down the care for that patient, and he should not, Allahu A'lam, usually he should not stay for a long time, but we do not deliberately cause his death. We can just be wise on how much care do we give him, because we have to see the priorities in the care. We have scarce resources, and we can just prioritize them. This is a very short statement that doesn't really explain.
We recognize that this is a huge topic, and I mean, I really want to give credit to your research. I think your research has been absolutely fantastic. Alhamdulillah, you know, maybe at some stage we could explore that in more detail. So I think we're doing some serious injustice by, you know, getting you to reflect on some of the work that you've done within a few minutes, because you put some very solid arguments for your position here. Now, what I do want to say is that there is a spectrum of opinions by Muslim scholars related to this particular topic. But Sheikh Dr. Tariq Al-Anqawi has clearly mentioned, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying is you recognize this idea of, let's just call it for the moment, let's call it biological death, where what that really means is that we've reached a stage where perfusion has stopped in the body. The heart's, there's been cardiopulmonary collapse, okay? There is no perfusion in the body. Now we know that this particular individual is now going to go through basically the body's going to start disintegrating, decomposing. That's the next stage that's going to happen now. So what you're saying is that if we know for sure that by turning life support off, that this is going to happen, then in that stage we would not be allowed to do that. Is that what it basically be prohibited for you to? Okay, so that's a position, and that is a position that I know.
With one important point that we have to measure the effect. Is it most likely or is it doubted? If it's doubted,
the levels of certainty. Yeah, the levels. So here we're talking about. Are we talking about? I mean, I'm going to use the term. Well, غلبة الظن, is that the level we need to be at? Certain. So a very high level of certainty. Okay, a very high level of certainty. Okay, right. So let's move forward. We're going to skip a bit more. The reason why I keep saying skip, because there's a mountain of stuff that we need to cover, even to discuss those things that we've discovered or talked about so far. Okay, so we recognize that we're in a situation now, and I'm going to go into a bit of fiqh and I'm going to go a bit into the Islamic sort of discourse amongst Muslim scholars related. I'm going to reflect on classical Muslim scholarly opinions as well. And this will give us an opportunity for both Dr. Abid and Dr. Al-Anqawi to come in as well in this wider discussion. Okay, now, so let me put forward an argument that has come from a number of scholars, some very reputable scholars, who talk about that fact that we go through stages before we lead to this stage that we've decided to call death proper. And death proper is a state where a person, we say, everybody feels comfortable in burying them now. Okay, so that's death proper. Now, there are certain states that an individual goes through before they reach death proper. Okay, now, so if I was to sum those stages up, okay, and there are certain Arabic terms that are being used to describe each one of those states from a Sharia perspective. So we have what we call, and those stages are called hayat. In other words, somebody is alive. We say that this is a life. Okay, so we have what we call hayat al-mustaqirah. Okay, so this is basically a life which is when a person is conscious, he's interacting with their environment, clearly awake, if you want to put it that way, and we would consider as that person, I think everybody would agree that person would be alive. Yeah. Then there is a state where we could potentially call, basically, we could say this is a stage of death proper. Okay, so this is haqiqi, maut al-haqiqi. This is death proper. Okay, then we say there's a stage that lands in between. So this is what some Muslim scholars argue, and that state that they call, and there's a number of different terms that are used for this this particular state. They call it, for example, 𝐼sh al-madhbur, or they may call it harakat al-madhbur. There's somebody who's just having involuntary movements in their body, or they are basically unconscious, but yet there is involuntary movement. So a term in English, sometimes what we do to explain that state is unstable life. So there is life, there is, or shall we say, there is stable life, there is unstable life, and there is death proper. Now, I want to focus on this concept of unstable life because this is, I think, the contentious part. Okay. Now, let me just explain first what some of these Muslim scholars put forward here as their argument related to this state of unstable life. So the first point is, for us, it doesn't really matter what brain death is. Okay, as Muslims, we're not too concerned about that. What we're concerned about is when, during this journey of a person being in a state of hayat al-mustaqirah, being alive, to the stage where they're dead, during that stage, what particular rulings are required of us? Are we permitted to do certain actions on this particular individual, okay, during that journey? Yeah, is it permissible to do it at this stage? Is it not permissible to do it at that stage? And what's permissible, what's not permissible? So I want to term this as death behaviors. So what particular death behaviors or certain actions can we enact in states of maybe even necessity? Yeah, for example, organ transplantation, retrieving organs. Throughout this whole journey, when can we do that? Now, the argument, I suppose, is that there are scholars who say that when we reach this state of unstable life, that is a stage that we can withdraw life-sustaining treatment. So this is in the state of 𝐼sh al-madhbur. We can withdraw life-sustaining treatment because rulings are enacted differently during unstable life relative to life, and also they resemble a lot of the rulings that occur when somebody has died, okay, or death proper. So they resemble a lot of the rulings that when somebody, like for example, they give examples such as inheritance. Okay, so if a person has reached a state of unstable life, then you can distribute their inheritance, for example. And that is something you can only do when somebody is considered as dead. But yet scholars have given an account that if an individual has reached that particular state, then they would be allowed to do that. So that's an interesting discussion. Now, I'm going to bring this to Dr. Sheikh Tariq Al-Anqawi first and get your understanding of that. And I know that I've read a lot of your works, and I know you have some very strong opinions related to that. And I really want you to tell us a bit about that, because I think it's important for us to know, because you've highlighted, I think people have just seen it as unstable and left it like that, and then thought, well, we can apply it like that, and discussed it in a very simplistic way. But there's a lot more complexity behind this, isn't there? You want to just give us I know you don't like to go into fiqh bath too much with general public, but in this particular discussion, if you can, in your own way, maybe, and I'll help you to articulate this, give us a bit of an idea about your thoughts related to this unstable life that we're talking about, the 𝐼𝐸 الْمَضْبُوط.
Okay. Yeah, maybe you can call it the slaughtered life, because as you said, when somebody is slaughtered, he still have some jerking movements and involuntary movements. In this stage, it's not, of course, it's not a new medical state. It's an old thing that happens, and especially when you slaughter animals, you can see it clearly. But it can happen to humans sometime when there is a crime committed. So actually, the fuqaha, I'm referring here to the old fuqaha, not to the contemporary fuqaha. They have clearly made a distinction between two kind of unstable life. One that is reached by a crime, where you will have something that will affect the structure of the body. The head will be
like assault, a serious assault on a person. On the jinaya. So
structurally, this person, it's impossible that he will continue life. He will just jerk, and everything will be.
So in other words, the trauma is that severe, the assault is that severe, and that basically we are certain that person is going to die.
And actually, they have emphasized that it's something from outside, committed by someone. It's not a
internal illness.
Yeah, it's not a sickness, because they clearly said when it's a sickness, we don't apply these rules of this in between life.
I'm going to come to this point that you're raising here, but we'll come to that in a second.
For the contemporary scholars, they missed the point here, and they just equaled the two states. And then they made another mistake, and they equaled the brain death to that state. Because actually, even if you look at the life science and how the life course of the brain dead person goes, it doesn't follow the same pattern at all. There are huge differences. He is not the brain dead person does not have a reason that can nullify life 100%. I mean by life here, a continuous life which can last for a considerable time. Not just like seconds or minutes of involuntary movements. Also, you have some stability in the life signs, like the blood circulation, heart beating. The slaughtered case, the blood is going out in very big quantities, and it's impossible to control this or make it slow or stop it. So. This is the main problem that happens here. The other problem, also very interesting one, is that even if we consider a brain dead as equal as the slaughtered life, actually the rulings that the fuqaha has put as special rulings for that kind of life, they are cautiousness rulings, meaning that they apply these rulings if they do not harm, if they do not make death more quick. Guess what? And they have said this very clearly. For example, you cannot bury a person in that state, but you can say that his relatives don't acquire his money.
Death proper, as we understood. Yes.
Yeah, you can say that people that his relatives will not acquire his money yet, his wife divorce or marriage estate and things like that. But if you say that I want to bury him quickly, I want to wash him, they refuse that because it will harm. So they're just like trying to put a theoretical concept of a between life that will have some rulings for consciousness. What's happening in brain death is the opposite exactly. We are using this in between life to make the death very fast, because we are just literally opening the patient and harvesting his organs, and we will make this something certain and imminent for this person. So the analogy here is very يعني I don't want to say use
let's just say you feel very uncomfortable that people are making an analogy of 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐧 with the concept of biological death.
It's very different. But I just want to suggest something.
Okay.
Just
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we should answer a question which many audiences already posted in the question and answer section. We should put forward a concept for death. What is death? What is real death? Or as you said, what's the term you used? I think proper death.
Okay.
You proposed something, but I have my own way of so I don't know if it's that time or later, but
well, that's an interesting point, because my personal view on this is that we should not fall into the trap of the kind of trajectory that Western philosophy and Western ethicists are moving along, but we should go back to what our Sharia is telling us, because our Sharia is very rich. You know, there's the depth that you'll find in even, you know, straightforward discourse within the books of fiqh is quite intense. It's something that we have tangible out there that we can work with. And from my perspective, it's always been, from my understanding, from my research, that the fuqaha have talked more so when they've not really thought and stated that this is death. Okay, even though they've used sort of somatic signs, and they've said that these are somatic signs that you can use that will give you some kind of understanding that a person has died. Okay, they've mentioned them, but they've also demonstrated that they're not isolated signs. You have to use them all collectively, you know, and then that will give us a good understanding this person has died. So there are signs that you could say that somebody has undergone putrefaction, for example.
Can I put a small comment here, please?
Yeah.
Yeah, what I reached to after reflecting and trying to read what the fuqaha said from different schools about this, what I think, Allahu A'lam, all the idea of the giving a judgment that a person is certainly dead goes back to that we cannot, in most cases, we cannot say that someone, the soul has departed in a certain point. But actually we can know this after that. How? There are signs of death that will show on the person. It will, in the medical terminology, it will show that he's decomposing to his decompositions reach to a state of irreversibility, a state where he's very different than living persons. So usually we judge this after some time passes, when someone is deteriorating to death. But what brain death is trying to doing, they're trying, proponents, I mean, they're trying to make it faster in a quicker point. So that's why we're having two kind of conflicting signs in that person. So people keep saying, how do you know that someone is dead? Well, after he's dead, you will know. You will see the signs. But if you are rushing to say that he's dead in a quick, very early point, of course you will have a problem. So that's the simple way to view this.
I'm just going to reflect on my own personal research and some of the things that I have been very interested in writing about, and pen to paper on some of these issues. So from my understanding, going back to classical books of fiqh, as well as some of the contemporary discussions as well, I'm completely with Dr. Tariq Al-Anqawi on the issue that people have oversimplified the idea of what we call 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐽, this concept of unstable life, let's say. Yeah. Now, so I've been spending quite a bit of time looking into the parameters of what is 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐽. What makes fuqaha now say that this is a state that we would accept as 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐽? Okay. So I've brought it down to two things, two big, broad things. One is, number one, they clearly relate that we need to be certain that this person is going to die. That's a very important condition. In other words, the trauma or the assault has to be that severe that we know the person is going to die. So in other words, and they even stipulate a time frame. So they say maybe within a day or half a day or something along those lines. But we know that this person will die very soon. So that clearly is the kind of a time frame they're looking. So for that reason, they've clearly outlined that when it comes to jinaya or a criminal assault on somebody, criminal assaults are usually with some kind of intention. That you go, and they've even gone to the details of what kind of the depth and the seriousness of the trauma do we look at to say that somebody has died. And they've even gone to that level of detail. So they've said things like, for example, if the throat has been slit and it's a deep cut into the throat, you know you're going to take some of the main arteries, that person you know is going to die. They even go as far as saying if you cause a massive open wound of the abdomen and even the organs, you know, some of the organs, you know, are expelled from the abdomen, then we know that that person is going to die. So we know that for that reason, so they require certain states of, or the certain severity of trauma. So the question now, going back to Dr. Anqawi's point, and he was saying that, but look, this discussion is under Kitab al-Jinayah. In other words, it's in the books of, you know, criminal offenses where people are assaulting people, and hence the fuqaha have said that when a person reaches this state where there's been that level of assault, they've not died yet. So they clearly said they have not actually died yet. What actually has happened is that they are unconscious. You could say that they are completely unconscious. They are not. They have no reception of what's happening around in their environment.
And very near.
The only kind of movement that's happening in them is involuntary movement. Okay, so that may be reflexive movements of the hands, even clasping of the fingers. They said even to that degree. So, and you know, that's been the kind of state that they're normally in. That stage is basically what they consider as unstable life. Now, certain fuqaha, and I'm talking about classical fuqaha, have also outlined that this is something that cannot be stated in somebody. So you can't have an unstable life in somebody who is dying or has in the process of dying because of a sickness or an illness, okay, or a disease condition. Let's say a terminal condition. And the interesting point is, so I was really interested to find out why differentiate between the two. And it's interesting. My conclusion is, from my depth, and then, you know, I've brought the resources to that, is that because the point is that you don't know what is the cause of the death of this person when their person is dying. When they reach this state, even if they've gone unconscious, let's say you know that their movements are involuntary, you don't know what the cause of that is that has led to death. Now you can imagine in the medieval times, they didn't have, you know, the kind of advanced technology that we have today, where they could put down clearly that this is the cause of the death. All they saw was somebody would become very, very unwell. They had a fever or whatever it was. Then they would fall unconscious, but we don't know what that illness. And it's interesting that in the kitabs, it even mentions that there are times where you think that somebody is in this state. So they have all the somatic signs to say that there is 𝐁 al-madhbu, but that would not be considered 𝐁 al-madhbu because those individuals, they could come out of it. Yeah, because we don't know what the cause of that death is. So reality is that if you look at this idea, the reason why they have not attached it to the idea of somebody being in the state of unstable life because of an illness is because of the fact that we don't know the cause. But the argument now stands, and I know that there are certain Muslim scholars have mentioned this as well. The argument that stands now is that we do know the cause, and we know that some of these conditions, we know that if we were to remove the life-sustaining treatment on these particular individuals, they would actually die. And they would die within a day or half a day. So, and we can see that they have involuntary movement. And they would fulfill the somatic symptoms that we described as 𝐁 al-madhbu. Yeah. But with the diagnostics that we have today, we can say now that we know the cause of their death. As historically, we will not be able to. And I know Dr. Anqawi is probably going to have something to say about that. Before I go into Dr. Anqawi, it's very important for us to hear a physician's perspective on this and what your thoughts are about the discussion. I don't know, Dr. Abid, I don't know whether you've heard this kind of discussion before. What are your thoughts about this?
Right. So I think there's
just a reflection of what you're hearing.
Yeah. Okay.
And we're going to open this to the audience as well. So
right. I hope you can hear me because I know you can't see me. So I think the important thing here is you have the dying process. And then you have death. So death is actually an event, whereas the dying is a process. So in terms of brain death and the other form of death we have for organ donation is controlled circulatory arrest. There we're drawing a line within the dying process. So we know it's not actually death.
Okay.
Now, you mentioned about the time
I
scale.
think we've all come to that conclusion that it's not actually death. But the
Right,
question
so-
now arises,
Right.
are they in an
So-
unstable life that we can now employ certain rulings? from
Right.
them?
Okay. So as you say, time scale
Or
is
death
very
behavior.
important. Time scale of when they're going to die is important. So if we look at cases where there is no confusion that they were absolutely dead. If you look at the data now, so if you look at the data for 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐧,
Okay.
she was diagnosed by 2 professors and an intensivist that she was
Yes.
brain dead. She had a radionucleotide scan to confirm there was no blood going to the brain. Yet
Yes.
she survived for over 5 years.
Yes.
Yeah. And you mentioned that if we withdraw the life support, they'll die in a short
Yeah.
period of time. That's true for everyone who's dependent, ventilator dependent.
Yes.
So you can't bring brain death into that issue. So if you look at the case of JK, he lived for more than 20 years and he was
Yes.
confirmed brain death. When they
Yes.
did this post-mortem, there was no brain there.
Yes.
So if you're talking about time scale, that they're going to die in a short scale of time, as you have with slaughtered animals, and brain dead people can live for a very long period of time. And there have also been recent cases where people who have been diagnosed as brain dead in university hospitals, so there's little doubt they were brain dead, have made a full recovery. You know,
Can I just to play the devil's advocate here, just to reflect on, because sometimes what we do is we talk about sacrificial animals and how we sacrifice animals and we slaughter them, and this is the kind of ḥayāt al-maẓbūḥ that we're talking about. But sometimes we don't do the reverse discussion in terms of human and reflecting on how that would reflect on animals. So for example, let's say you have tied up the arteries that lead to the brain of a chicken, let's say, yeah, or you've severed it, okay, you've severed it, but yet you've put them on a system or an ECMO or ventilator or whatever to keep their bodily perfusion going. Yeah, the question for us that would be really interesting for us to know, even in that state, because we could keep this chicken going for quite a number of years doing this, yeah, but yet it'd probably not have a head. Yeah. So the question arises, would the classical fuqaha have said that this is 𝐼sh al-maẓbūḥ? Because you're probably still seeing some involuntary movements possibly in this particular animal. Would they have still considered this as 𝐼sh al-maẓbūḥ, even in that state, that even though it had been prolonged for a number of years? Because what we do is we are supporting the perfusional process in this particular animal, which we can make, and we can do this indefinitely. If you've got the technology, you can do something like that indefinitely. At the moment, our technology is not that great, but we could probably come to a time where we could keep a human body living indefinitely, where the biological system is working and it's not becoming dysfunctional. But yet the brain's become dysfunctional. There's no function there, or there's been a brain arrest, whatever. Now, in that kind of scenario, I'm just giving you that as an analogy. How would you relate to that in this particular discussion?
Question for me?
For anyone, Dr. Ankawi, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think this kind of we can call it, I think, a philosophical experiment.
I'm saying this deliberately because we are now achieving a level of technology and advanced technology, but we are able to do this.
Okay, let's assume that this is possible. Although assuming theoretical things that are real and then trying to reflect on that, sometimes it's misleading. But let's just, for the sake of argument, see what it could leads us. What I think is that artificial means of maintaining life here, in that case, they interfere and they actually prevent the chicken from reaching to that al-madhbuh state.
Yes.
Because once you have a stable life science that can go along for a long time, you cannot have the definition of the 𝐼ش al-madhbuh. The idea of 𝐼ش al-madhbuh, from my perspective, is the idea behind it is that someone is getting very near to death, that you can start to doubt that he is already dead. In this case, the fiqh rule says ما قارب الشيء أخذ حكمه. what becomes very near to something, it will take its rules. So this has many examples in the Sharia, even in non-criminal judgments. So I think this is the idea behind it. So once you interfere and prolong the somatic health, then you are preventing this from happening. So you cannot give it the same rulings, in my opinion. And the point
that's probably debatable, because we look at somatic signs, we know that this particular living thing, we recognize it's living, is on a trajectory to death, and the only reason that it's been left in the state it is because we've got them on a life support, and that's what's doing it.
But actually,
now, I just want to move on. Because we're very limited in time, and we'll have we could go into forever discussing this, inshallah. I just want to put another point forward, okay? And this is an interesting point, and it's a point worth discussing, and that is, we recognize that if we accept, let's say there's many of us that will not accept that this is 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐧, okay, we accept that, okay, but let's say if we were to accept that this is 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐧, and or it comes there is an analogy we can apply the rulings of 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐧. It does not follow to this particular individual. Let's just say for argument's sake. Now we know that there are certain rulings in Islam that we can employ that are death behavior rulings in these particular 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐧 individuals. And one very, very important ruling is the issue of qisas. So this is where you have a death penalty of the person who was assaulted. So that's a very serious crime, to that degree that you're taking somebody's life on the basis of this particular ruling. So this is a ruling where, let me give it, this is the case study. The case is that one person, an individual, comes to a person who's been, let's say, for example, assaults them, and the assault was such that he slit their throat, or he placed some huge wound in their abdomen, and some of their organs came out or were expelled. And this individual collapsed on the floor, fell unconscious, and the only kind of movement that was happening was what we call harakat al-madbu, which was involuntary movements. Person was not conscious to what's happening in their environment whatsoever. They weren't responding. At the most, they weren't speaking. They weren't speaking too coherently, and this is the kind of state that they were in. Now, in that state, the classical fuqaha have said that this state would be a state where, if another person had come and they were to now slit their throat, and clearly, to even take off their head, then the qisas would be on that first individual, not on the second individual. And let's say, for example, they had not ended up in that state. In other words, they were still slightly conscious. They were, and the movements that they were doing are not just solely involuntary. Then, in that situation, from the first assault, the qisas would be on the second person, and that person who had now come and slit their throat. Now, you can see there's some slight rulings, and they've also talked about this other additional rulings related to that. That is, rulings related to inheritance would apply there. There are rulings related to iddah, which apply there, which is the waiting period. The rulings of nikah would being invalid would apply at that stage. So we can see that there are certain, and this is what we call, and they call this as mawt al-hukmi. So this is basically a state where you can apply legal rulings, i.e. it's legal death. Okay, it's a normative state. Okay, and they still call it 𝐁𝐸 𝐎𝐧. So they still call it, it's a life which is unstable, and hence they still say that this person's not completely dead in the sense that we see death proper. Now, taking that into consideration and going back to the case of assault, we have fuqaha who have stated that the first person who has led this person to a life of unstable death or unstable life, then that is the individual who qisas would be placed on. That's the penalty for that individual. Now, however, if another person had come after that and assaulted this person, even if they'd slit their throat to that degree or taken the head off, the qisas, even if their intention was to murder this individual, qisas would not be put onto the second person. Now, that's an interesting point, because they say rather what would happen is ta'zir would be placed on the second person. Ta'zir is where the qadi, the judge, would make a decision about what punishment would go out and be meted on the second person, not on the first, because the first person is qisas, but rather the punishment on the second person would be such that it be ta'zir. And ta'zir is something where a judge can overlook a situation on the basis of what that intention may have been in that individual. They may take a number of factors into consideration, and also on the basis of the family. So the family may forgive that person. The family may forgive that person, the second person I'm talking about. Yeah, they may just forgive that person. Now let's take the analogy here. I'm just theoretically discussing this because I think it's an important discussion. Let's say we were to retrieve an organ from that person in this state. So we were taking a very important organ like the kidneys or like the heart, for example, and we were to retrieve that particular organ in this particular state. The question is, yes, that's basically, and they even say that this is an issue of hurma. In other words, to do with the ikram ikram of the body. So they don't say it's about you've taken their life. They're saying that basically this is about they have assaulted the dignity of that body. So with the same kind of discussion we talk about organ transplantation. Let's say in that situation we know that this is for a medical purpose. It's for an issue of necessity. So in that situation, could you put that argument? That you, in somebody who is considered as being in this particular state, you can retrieve their organs. I'm opening this question to any of you, Dr. Abid Hussain and Dr. Tariq Al-Anqawi, and I'm going to finish on this note, and then we're going to open the questions to the rest of the audience. So the rest of our audience, if you have anything to say, you can come online in a short while. And at the moment, I'll any Dr. Abid Hussain, you raise your hand.
Okay, so what I was going to say, the situation you're portrayed, we have to take into account the rule of consent. So we have to ask ourselves, is a Muslim allowed to give consent to allow a surgeon to take his life for the sake of donating his organs? Rather, because the situation you put forward doesn't take that into account. And that's very crucial.
Yes, consent is very, very important. Yes, accepted. Dr. Anqawi, do you want to add anything before we open up to yours? Because I know our audience has a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So we want to give them a bit of time as well. And we are falling a bit behind. So if we don't need to answer these questions because it's just a discourse. It's just a discussion, isn't it, at this stage?
I just want to comment on the last theoretical situation you raised. I think it's prohibited for the second person to have this assault done, because it's still an assault. It's still a crime. Yes.
But remember, we're talking about darura here. So this is a state where we're doing it for medical purposes.
But the point of fuqaha is that this is not a cause of death. That's why they discuss qasas and that he's not punished as a killer, because he did not kill. He did not inflict a new harm that will cause the death. This death was caused already. It was imminent. It was coming 100% because he is in 𝐼𝐸 الْمَذْبُوح. So it's an argument of who is responsible, not an argument of is this a crime or not. It's still a crime. And the second point,
Anqawi, I mean, the point here is that even the relatives can forgive that individual because this is a ta'zir.
They don't have the right.
If you were going to go to this situation of saying this is a criminal offense, what you have done, the question now is, if there's a qadi who has made that decision, he said this was done for medicinal purposes, it was done out of necessity, we're trying to retrieve organs, and this is something that we've accepted as a society, then how would that relate then? Would that be considered as a crime? Because that person's intention is not to
if we're talking about
the person's intention is to save another life.
If we're talking about the theoretical situation, someone is in the ground, he's not on the ventilator, then they don't have the right to assault him, even if he allows, not only if the relatives allow. But if we're talking about the practical situation where he's on life support, this is actually a different case. It's not actually. You must recall something, that the fuqaha, when they say that the unstable life has special considerations, these were in the purpose of cautiousness. They explicitly said that you cannot inflict danger, you cannot inflict harm. Anything that would harm, you should refrain from. You cannot bury that person. So, as I said, the core of the
it's an interesting discussion, I think, on inshallah, hopefully, maybe a more detailed discussion that we can probably have.
And also, don't forget the stability of the brain dead person. He's stable. He's somatically stable. So the analogy has many aspects of defect.
Okay. Inshallah. Now we have somebody called iPhone here. So I think you want to say something. So if you have any questions, so this is questions to the audience now. If anybody wants to ask any particular questions.
Hello.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Wa alaikum.
If the heart is beating normally and the rest, the patient cannot move, doesn't understand, his eyes are closed, he's dead, but his heart is beating normally. What should we do? Should we remove his ventilator and let him die? Or I know somebody who is for years like this. Please.
Okay. Dr. Abid Hussain, do you want to reflect on that? For somebody who's
I think
on a
we
regular
need a
basis?
bit more detail, because what he said,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what he's
More
trying to
detail.
say. The person's dead, but the only thing is that his heart is beating. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, what is the diagnosis?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
The diagnosis, well, he fell, he had an accident. And
Okay.
since then, for years, he's on the bed.
Is he on a ventilator?
Yes.
So what have the doctors said looking after him?
Well, they say the brain, he's brain dead.
Which country is it in?
I cannot tell you that.
Well, the thing is, you need to know that, because that will decide whether the patient is legally dead or not. And that will determine the course of action.
Actually, Dr. Abid, you know where is that patient, but
So,
I will
there's a lot
talk to
more
you in private.
complexities.
Okay,
we're
you
trying
can
to move on.
contact me. Contact me later on if you know me.
Okay.
But, no problem.
There is the point that Dr. Abid is trying to raise here, that you'll find that this isn't something which is a standard that everybody accepts. It's just something that we just consider as a given. But rather, you'll find that different countries have different legal statuses and different standards of what they would consider as brain death or neurological death or death to that degree where you can actually, retrieve organs, things like that, which is a valid point. And hence, the question when it was raised, it's loaded and it doesn't really explain, which particular standards it fulfills and so forth. Well, let's just move on. So we got Tofail Nuruddin. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, so Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. So just a few considerations, especially for Dr. Tariq Anqawi. So we know that obviously Islam tries to preserve life. Part of the maqasid of Sharia is that we try to preserve life. But then what does it say about the quality of life? So you might have someone that is neurologically dead, but then if you keep them on life support continuously, then and even if at some point they're able to come back, what is their quality of life going to be? So and I understand like the more liberal and utilitarian approach is that it's better to give their organs to somebody, and as you mentioned rightly, that's just a pragmatic position, so that organs can be given and so on and so forth. But what does Islam have to say regarding those lines? That's the first thing. And second thing is I have a paper that I have to write on what defines bad death. Would you be able to point me towards Islamic writings, whether contemporary or classical, on bad death? Sorry, these are two questions. So if you could just answer, any of you can answer actually. Jazakumullah khair.
So let's start with Dr. Tariq Anqawi, because you put the question to him. So I suppose, is there such thing as quality of life or a meaningful life when we enter this discussion about, let's say, for example, withdrawing life support?
Yeah, sure. Pursuing a good quality of life is something considered in Sharia, and it should be put into consideration. But the situation we are handling here in end-of-life care typical cases is a situation where the two goals conflict. If you preserve life, then you will cause the life to continue with the low quality. That's the argument of the people who are the proponents of withdrawing life support and withholding. So it's not a normal case. So here you have to balance. yes, in Sharia we have the pursuing the quality of life. We have the rule of hardship, where you should push hardship and minimize hardship, and bring ease to a person. But you should have a boundary where you are not allowed to inflict death and neglect compulsory treatments. And here we have to define what is compulsorily. These have some parameters that also goes back to the idea of weighing the two things together, easiness and preserving life. So it's a very complicated discussion that I can maybe summarize in 10 minutes, but not less, 5 to 10 minutes at least.
I mean,
so,
yes. So,
yeah,
I mean,
but that's the main idea. We have to shift from just considering quality of life, neglecting the intrinsic value of life, which the new bioethics focus on, to combine both and try to make a sort of weighing and combining of both of these values.
So, I mean, just to add to Dr. Anqawi's point, which is quite important, and I think the important point of what he's raised is the complexity that arises from an Islamic perspective is quite different, not necessarily the same as the kind of discourse that would happen amongst Western physicians or philosophers. And that is for Muslims, what is important is, number one, is the treatment that we're using, when we talk about it being life-sustaining, the question is to what certainty is that? Yeah, how, using this particular individual, in this particular case, how certain are we that this treatment is going to cure this person of this trajectory to death? Okay. The second point is, what is the current illness that this person is suffering from? Is this underlying illness such that this person is going to die? Now, clearly, if the person is not going to die, or there's the chance of them dying is, we would say less than half. In other words, it's less than 50% chance that they're going to die. Then it wouldn't be obligatory that you continue on this life-sustaining treatment. If it was more than that, then the argument is that it would be, yes. And then if the sustaining treatment that we have is not as effective, or it's not more than 50% effective, then the argument would be that is it still obligatory that we continue with that treatment? So there are many factors around effectiveness, level of certainty.
So, Dr. Rafaq, just to specify my question to cater to
going back to the point of quality of life,
Sorry.
So, or meaningful life. Now, there are some scholars who also reflect on this from the perspective of meaningful life, and for them, meaningful life is that, are they accountable to the Sharia? Are they accountable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So we talk about this from the perspective of taklif. So the question is, do they have taklif? Are they people who are now accountable? If they are, let's say, for example, permanent unconsciousness, okay, so we got somebody in a PABS state. Now, in that situation, this person has no form of interaction with the external world. Some scholars would argue that even in a state like that, they would be rewarded because they're in that state. Others would argue and say, look, the state that they're in is such that they are not obligated in any form or manner. So that life is not something that would be considered as a meaningful. I'm not going to use the word is not a life worth living. I'm saying it's not a meaningful life. And in that situation, you would be permitted to remove life-sustaining treatment. So those kind of discussions are out there.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, that clarifies a lot. Would you guys be able to answer the second question, the definition of a bad death in Islam?
Dr. Tariq, you want to answer that?
Maybe Dr.
What is a bad death? I mean, from our perspective, I suppose a bad death.
My personal view, it goes back to the believing state of the person. If you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're doing good deeds, then no matter how suffering you will face, your end is good. Of course, we should lift suffering and we should minimize pain and hardship. But to say that this is a bad death because someone has suffered, no, it has another face. The other face is that he's being rewarded and he's going to a life which is much more broader. There is no relation between the two lives. It's much more longer life and it's endless life. Here where he will have the compensation for his patience and suffering. So one should not get into the trick of defining good and bad in that case with only the word view that see life as just dunya, as just the here life, but one should also think of the hereafter. One should think of the benefit of reward that will be giving, and this is what gives the meaning of life actually. If you don't have this, even if you are walking and running in the street and enjoying any kind of pleasure in life, you will still have suffering inside of you because you're losing the meaning. In the end, you're dying in any way, whether you call it good or bad. So if you don't realize this meaning, you're heading to a bad death, and a bad death can be defined also by what's the consequences of this death. So this might be a little bit near to the answer, inshallah, but maybe Dr. Abid can add something.
Just before we get to Dr. Abid, I just add a point there that we need to be careful that we don't confuse this idea of a bad death and a good death to the discussion that we're currently having related to the legal stances, the Islamic Sharia legal stances. Even though you may have a bad death, that doesn't justify us removing life-sustaining treatment, if you know what I mean. So because for Muslims, a good death and bad death is a spiritual response. It's the question. I mean, there's a dua translated into English on the meaning along the lines of that, Ya Allah, if my life is such that it's beneficial for me to live, so that I can earn more reward, then give me a longer life. And Ya Allah, if I am in a situation where it's such that my living longer is such that I am just earning your wrath, then take my life. So that would be in essence the understanding of a good death and a bad death. That a good death is one where somebody, they've lived a good life, they've been very obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they've done tawbah over their past sins, they have now they're living this last phase of their just before they die, and that is the phase where they are becoming very cognizant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is a good death. That is a good death. And a bad death is one where they're not cognizant of those things.
So I guess my question was more from an Islamic medical ethics perspective rather than a spiritual one. And what I mean by that is basically what would justify like removing life support or access to maid, in the writings of our fuqaha. So we have qawaid fiqhiyya, for example, about al-darar al-ashaddu yuzalu bil-darar al-akhaf. Would we take those into consideration? Like, can we say, for example, this person is sinful, so that's why his death would be bad, so we would remove life support? I feel like that would not sit well with a lot of people. So
yeah, I'm going to move on because I'll just quickly address that. Dr. Tariq Khankawi has already mentioned this, and he talked about the different balances that we need to take into consideration. So that's also darar, that he's making reference to that, the concept of harm. These would be taken into consideration. So is it more harmful, physically to the dignity of the body to continue life-sustaining treatment? That would come into the equation as well. So that would address the issue of darar. Okay, so we will. I apologize that our time's run out or is running out. So inshallah, I know there's a lot of people who have put questions on Q&A. I'm going to address some of the questions on the Q&A. Some of you put very long comments on that. Unfortunately, I cannot go through them because it'll take me too long. Some of those questions have been already addressed. I'm going to put a question to Dr. Abid Hussain. So we've got an anonymous attendee who said the esteemed anesthetist Dr. Hussain said brain death is likened to brain failure or brain arrest, like heart failure or cardiac arrest. But the difficulty here is that heart failure and cardiac arrest are entirely different entities. If indeed brain death is brain failure, then then that means that it is no longer functioning the way it should, and the brain is not able to output valuable electrical activity to the whole body, which is necessary for its function. And just like the heart in heart failure fails to pump blood around the body, and gradually the end organs start to fail, including kidneys. So the question arises, is it appropriate to say that brain death is like brain failure or brain arrest? Does Dr. Abid want to comment about that?
So these comments I made are not my personal opinions. These are the opinions of experts. So if you read the literature, these people have said, don't use the word brain death, because it is actually misleading, because the brain is not actually dead. And if you look at some of our fatwas, they seem to give fatwa based on the brain being dead. So they mention things like the brain starting to decompose. Whereas the clinical brain death is based on the function of the brain, which means no brain cells actually have to die for it to stop functioning. So what I said was actually quite valid. Obviously, no analogy is perfect, but some people would define brain death as total brain failure. That is a better term than calling it brain death.
Okay, inshallah. I'm just going to move on to another question, which is quite an important question because, and it's a question that keeps getting asked. Can we please first agree in what the definition of death is in Islam? And I think the point that if we was anything that I would put forward here is let's move away from this idea of what is the definition of death in Islam, because I don't think we're going to come to a conclusion. So rather what we should be asking ourselves is, at what stage in that journey, so I'm talking about the physiological state or whichever state of medical state or whichever state that person is in that trajectory to what we consider as death proper, are we allowed to enact certain rulings? That's the question that we need to be asking. I think what we're doing is we're trailing up the wrong track. Like, keep going back and asking, what is brain death? When can we say that somebody is defined as death? Because the general urf, and this is something that I've really experienced through my research in this topic, discussing with a number of people who got very sort of sensitive to some of those issues, is that let's just avoid the idea of saying this person is dead and therefore we can retrieve organs. But rather what we should be asking is the state that they're in, can we retrieve the organs in that state? And that's the kind of question we should be asking. The reason being, because for us and for the whole of the Muslim community, the only time that they're really going to accept that this person is dead is when they are ready to be buried. Okay, so when they're ready to be buried and everybody's assured that, well, I feel comfortable now that this person can be buried, that's when people will feel, you know, that there'll be a consensus that this is death. But when we start using death as a term and applying it to different stages prior to that, I think we're always going to come across different problems and different difficulties, and we're going to make claims to certain ideas that are being dictated by Western understanding of a philosophical understanding, Western philosophical understanding of what is considered as death. Okay, so I think we need to avoid that.
Can I have a short?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Short comment. There is also a mix between two things. The first is the definition of death, which is something in the non-Islamic literature is something philosophical. In Islam, it's just simply departing the soul from the body. So this is the definition. This is the concept. But when you come to the criteria, where you specify the pillars that will satisfy this definition, here you usually say that you must reach to a stage where signs are there that show you that the person has passed the point of death, has passed the point. He's not in the point. You cannot say that he's in the point, except in one case, if his eyes are going up, where the Rasulullah ﷺ in one prophetic saying said that a Sahabi, his eye moves up while he was, his soul was departing. He said, إن الروح إن الإنسان إذا مات أتبع الروح البصر. When the person is dead, the eye will follow the spirit. But you don't have this in brain death, because the idea of brain death is that you know, the nerves that supply the facial contractions are already distracted, and so you don't have these signs. So you have to distinguish between the definition and the concept, and in another hand the criteria. And after that there is a third thing actually, where you specify the parameters, the medical clinical parameters to say that this specific person is already dead. Here you say that cessation of heartbeat for a long time, or maybe more accurately, cessation of circulation for enough time, maybe usually 30 minutes in normal circumstances. You can say that this person for 100% sure, he will not respond to CPR, he will not get his circulation back. Even if you put an ECMO and make his circulation, try to make his circulation move again, you cannot do this and you will not reach to any result. In this case, we can say that he's dead for 100% sure. But we don't have to reach to this, because in normal circumstances, just cessation of heartbeat with the CPR failure or with a circumstance where no CPR will be giving for a long time, you can say he's dead. That's it. That's why the fuqaha did put additional parameters to make the judgment of death more sure when there is something that draws one to be skeptic. Like if someone has fell to a coma for some apparent reason, then you should not rush to burying him, although he looks like a dead person. But in normal circumstances, everyone knows who's dead, as Dr. Rifaqat, I think he was trying to point out.
Okay, inshallah. I'm going to put this now question to Dr. Abid Hussain. I think he's not really had the opportune time to really reflect on all this and explain it himself to us. So, Dr. Abid Hussain, is there anything that you want to add to this?
No, I think I can just confirm what Dr. Tariq has said, that ideally you want to declare death after actual death has taken place. That is to say, at the end of the dying process. However, for organ donation, this is a problem, because the conundrum in organ donation is we want living organs out of dead bodies, which is nonsensical. You just can't have that. So what we do, we label people who are actually living as dead and then retrieve their organs on the assumptions this is deceased organ donation. So if we accept that brain death is not actual death, then we have to, as a Muslim community, come up with ideas and protocols how we can move forward with organ donation organ donation and transplantation from an Islamic point of view. What we've done so far in the medical field is exactly what happened in Islamic finance. Every conventional finance contract has been made halal by legal gymnastics. And we're trying to do that same in Islam. We need to, stand back a little bit, see what our beliefs are, our values are, and then come up with protocols which satisfy that, rather than trying to find ways to satisfy a system which is already in progress.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Some very valid points there. Okay, inshallah. So we've come to the end of our time, and we've probably left you in state of more questions than you started off with, alhamdulillah. And that is good, because it means that you're thinking and you've understood the subject more in a much more greater level of depth, and hence you've got more questions to ask. So alhamdulillah, as part of Al-Balagh Academy, we have two interesting courses that are coming in your direction. The first is the Fiqh of Medicine Level 1, which will be starting on the 4th of September. And here we will be talking a number of different conundrums. So, brain death is just one of them, but there are many topics to discuss in terms of abortion and, when does life begin, and various other kind of, what kind of treatments are halal, what treatments are haram, and various other topics that we can bring to you. And this is a course that's been running for a number of different years. We've trained up approximately over 400, probably even more than that, physicians and ulama in this particular area, and we continue to do that. Our course is becoming stronger, and we have students from all over the world. We have ulama on there, we have physicians, we have people from the policy, so Department of Ethics and academics. So it's an interesting platform to join, inshallah. The other course that we have is one on organ donation transplantation course. So this is a course that some of you may find very interesting, especially those of you who have found this discussion really interesting. We recognize that there are a plethora of different sort of stances when it comes to organ donation. So we need to explore that. We need to talk about that more, and we need to go into the details and the kind of discussions that we've had today, being very open in terms of, the reflections from what the scholarly opinions are, and also to address the problems and the issues that arise as a result of those sort of opinions. So, this is an excellent opportunity for you to join our course on organ donation transplantation, which starts on the 18th of September. I think there'll be 2 links coming to you right now. So our admin team will be posting those links now, so you can see those courses on your chat platform. So Jazakumullah khair. I want to thank foremost our panelists, Dr. Abid Hussain, Dr. Tariq Anqawi. Alhamdulillah, it's been a very fruitful discussion. And we recognize that there is much more to be discussed, there is much more to be researched, and there's a real need for people who are learned, in these particular areas, be it from the medical side, from the Islamic side, to sit together and really, you know, crush this out and really get down to a good understanding about what our rich tradition has to say and contribute to this. Maybe something that we can contribute to even the non-Muslim discourse related to what would be considered as death and what kind of things we can do when we go through this journey and this discourse. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.